Hello, this is Stuart at creativeXP, and in this video I'm going to provide a design walkthrough of my Mario Maker 2 course Hard Hat High Rise. If you haven't played the level, you can find a link to my playthrough video and the course ID in the description below. So if you watched my previous design walkthrough video for my Slip and Slide Caverns course, you might remember that I introduced a Buzzy Beetle helmet to protect Mario from the falling icicles that were featured throughout the level. I realised at the time that there were a lot of possibilities to use this helmet gameplay in different ways, so with Slip and Slide Caverns complete, I was then inspired to create a new level that was focused entirely around this helmet ingredient. With the helmet gameplay selected, it was then just a matter of selecting a theme and story that could provide a good context as to why Mario would always be required to wear a protective headpiece. The obvious choice was to set the level in a construction setting, where workers are required to wear a hard hat to protect themselves on the site. From there, I decided that I could present a story that Bowser was constructing an ominous high-rise tower for some nefarious purpose, and it was up to Mario to stop its completion by taking out the evil construction crew. After testing some different combinations, I decided to use the Super Mario Bros. 3 game style and the Castle Course theme, as it offered a nice selection of objects and enemies that I could combine to present the construction site setting and story. This included these crate semi-solid platforms to represent different equipment waiting for installation, these bridges which I could use to create scaffolding, swinging claw cranes for moving heavy objects, and the brick and wooden blocks for construction materials. In terms of hazards, the spinning grinder blades and thwomps represented heavy construction machinery, and the hammer bros and rocky wrenches each make up the construction crew with their respective tool-based attacks. With this selection of ingredients, I could now begin considering the design constraints and various challenges that I wanted to present to players as part of this helmet-themed gameplay. For a helmet to be a meaningful requirement of the level, I would need a space that provided lots of hazards above the player's head. Now a horizontal level could achieve this, but the limited vertical movement would probably mean that the player can simply outrun most hazards without severe restrictions, which would make the playable experience less enjoyable. No, a vertical level is much more practical, and helps inform the story that this is a high-rise tower under construction. This would allow me to present a level that keeps the player constantly climbing upwards, encountering progressively harder challenges as they ascend higher. Now, before planning how I was going to build the level, I wanted to understand all the ways the helmet ingredient could be used to create different gameplay challenges and scenarios. To begin, it is worth noting that there are two types of helmets available to the player, one being the Buzzy Beetle helmet that I previously used in Slip and Slide Caverns, and the other being the Spiny helmet. Both helmets protect Mario from taking damage from enemies or hazards that would usually hurt him from above. This can be used to negate being squashed by a thwomp or deflect a hammer thrown by a hammer bro. That said, it is still possible for Mario to receive damage from the side or below whilst wearing a helmet. In this instance, the helmet will be knocked off Mario's head without him losing a life. Each helmet also allows the player to break certain blocks that would usually be indestructible when Mario jumps into them. The Buzzy Beetle helmet breaks standard brick blocks, and the Spiny helmet breaks the hard wooden blocks. This could be used to good effect to control the pacing of the level and gate player progression if they don't have the correct helmet equipped. It also adds an extra challenge where the player still needs to use caution to avoid losing their helmet when making their way to the progression gate. The Buzzy Beetle helmet will bump an enemy above the player out of the way if Mario jumps into them, whereas the Spiny helmet will kill most enemies, making it a powerful offensive tool in the right scenario. This can be constrained by ensuring that the player has less opportunity to approach an enemy from below if I want to limit Mario's offensive ability whilst wearing the Spiny helmet. Both helmets can be picked up and thrown to break blocks or kill enemies, but if the player chooses to do this, they will likely require another helmet to progress, not to mention avoid being hit by a rebounding helmet. Once again, I tested a lot of these mechanics in different combinations to define the challenges that I would create throughout the level, with each one getting progressively more difficult as the player climbs the high-rise tower. Now let's look at how all that came together, beginning with the level's start area. The first area of the level is supposed to represent the entrance to the construction site. I added some blue fallen platforms here to introduce the player to these ingredients, which will feature throughout the level, so that they can be prepared to move quickly next time they land on one of them. They provide an easier alternative path above a few Goombrats, and if taken at a sprint, can let the player pull off a fun little sequence of jumps to reach the site entrance. The entrance is patrolled by a red Koopa Trooper. Using their shell, players can break the block to enter this small space, which is meant to be a worker's changing room. Here they would receive their helmet before proceeding onto the site through the narrow chute. The chute also doubles to provide an escape route for the red shell after it has unlocked the entrance, as well as quickly getting rid of a helmet if the player accidentally kicks it instead of putting it on their head, thus triggering another helmet to be delivered from the pipe. I did need to make it clear to the player that dropping down the chute was not the way to go to progress. A combination of directional arrow and coins provides a not so subtle indication of which way to go. Jumping to collect coins without the helmet equipped will inform the player that they can't break these blocks this way. Having just broken the same type of blocks with the red Koopa shell, the player should understand that the blocks are not entirely indestructible. Piecing all these signs together, they should understand that wearing a helmet is required to progress. Once taught this key aspect of the level's theme, the player is given another simple introduction to the rules of the Buzzy Beetle helmet. This Goombrat is patrolling a section of scaffolding with hard wooden blocks at each end. Jumping into these wooden blocks has no effect, showing the player that these blocks cannot be destroyed, unlike the standard brick blocks. Attacking the Goombrat whilst wearing the helmet also tells the player that they can safely bump the enemy out of the way. The position of the wooden blocks constrains the Goombrat's movement, therefore increasing the likelihood that the player will bump them as they try to jump up onto the scaffolding. Depending which direction the enemy is bumped, it will either become trapped here, or sent off the edge. From here, a trail of coins and a blue platform below suggests the way to go. Once landing on the platform, the player begins falling, creating a briefly tense moment before they reveal a blue pipe that provides an alternative entrance for Mario to enter the site. This is the start of the main high-rise section, and where the level switches to the vertical orientation described earlier. To maximize the space available for different areas of the level, I created a partition using a line of ground blocks to lock the camera's horizontal movement. I used the same trick when creating the different cavern sections in my slip and slide caverns course. Arriving on the ground floor of the tower, the player is presented with another pipe that dispenses replacement Buzzy Beetle helmets should they happen to have lost theirs at any point. Here you can see how I have color coded the different pipes to make it clear to the player that green pipes are for helmets, whilst the blue pipes are ones that the player can enter. This color coding will continue to be used throughout the rest of the level. A couple of rocky wrenches provide a small enemy presence here, but one that shouldn't pose any major threat to the player. I intentionally positioned them at the far end of the room from the player to provide plenty of time to avoid any wrenches that they throw their way. Jumping onto the yellow elevator, the player can reach the large scaffold platform to collect a few coins, where they'll get a sudden surprise from a thwomp smashing some bricks above them. A good reminder to wear your hard hat when you're on the construction site. Having opened the way, Mario can now safely jump up to meet some other thwomps hard at work in this section of the tower. Using the crate, the player can avoid this thwomp as it attempts to smash them, where they can then begin breaking the bricks above to enter the next tunnel. I included a small escape tunnel to return to the low level in case the player lost their helmet and were unable to proceed at this point. I also added a brick block here to provide a little more destructive impact to the initial thwomp attack as the player jumps over it. This also provides a little bit of foreshadowing for the next encounter, as the player enters this tunnel and another thwomp starts to break its way through the wall towards them. This creates a time pressure for the player, where they must race to smash the bricks above to find a way out of the tunnel before the thwomp breaches through the wall and squashes them. The player should be able to create an opening above at the last moment before the thwomp lunges forward once again, only this time the player can easily jump over its attack. Doing so also gives the player an opportunity to collect the first optional bonus in the form of the 30 coin at the other end of the tunnel. Players still need to be quick if they want to grab this and backtrack to escape the tunnel before the thwomp retracts and traps the player though. Exiting the tunnels, the player is given a brief respite after that tense section of angry thwomps, where they now have a small puzzle to solve. The way is blocked by another brick wall, but there are no Koopa shells to be found to break it open like they did before. Thankfully, there is another supply of Buzzy Beetle helmets that the player can throw down the corridor and bust open the wall. The spike traps suspended from the ceiling make jumping in this room risky and provide an indication that throwing the beetle shell from range may be the best option. A single rocky wrench is present on the other side of the wall to create some slight pressure in the form of wrench projectiles that need to be avoided as the player makes their way through this room. In this next area, the player climbs a series of scaffolds and falling platforms that are patrolled by more Goombrats. With a helmet equipped, these jumps should be reasonably easy as the player bumps the enemies out of the way on their ascent. Once at the top, the player can use this trail of coins and platforms to point the way towards their first swinging claw crane ingredient. By hitching a ride on this crane, the player can coordinate a jump between the second crane to bypass the hazardous floor below. Clearly, Bowser has requested spike traps for insulation material to make this tower as evil as possible. Once safely on the next piece of scaffolding, the player has another opportunity to re-equip their helmet and collect some coins before entering the next room above. In here, the player is greeted by the first level mini-boss, a foreman that is carrying a key to stop Mario progressing further up the tower. Starting on the high scaffolding above the player, the foreman rains down hammers to prevent Mario from getting the height advantage that would allow him to jump on the foreman's head. However, with the helmet equipped, these attacks can be harmlessly deflected, and the player can use the bump mechanic to shove the foreman off their high ground so that they can safely time their counterattack. After the foreman has been dealt with, Mario can collect the key and unlock the door to progress further up the tower.
Uh-oh.
Or so it seems. Turns out that the foreman was actually guarding the entrance to an unfinished elevator shaft, and now Mario is in big trouble. Which treacherous monster designed this place anyway? So yeah, I decided to throw another surprise in for the player to keep them on their toes. Coming straight off the back of a mini-boss encounter seemed like a moment that most players would not be expecting such a challenge. Typically, after a major encounter, the player would be given a respite to recover themselves before progressing on to the next harder challenge. I also considered the different player emotions in these sequences, especially in terms of pacing the experience to avoid it becoming too repetitive and boring. Having the player descending and losing their current progress up the tower also evokes an emotional response of loss, leading to determination to regain their progress. With that in mind, the timing of this trap was actually well placed to keep the player engaged and would provide the basis for a similar, yet more affirmative surprise later in the level. This elevator sequence was also partially inspired by a need to have the player descend so that I could then make the most of the limited space available in Mario Maker to construct levels vertically. Now I did also consider the chance of failure with this sequence, which if too high could have the negative effect of annoying players to the point that they just decide to stop playing the level altogether after dying. Obviously, this is not something that I want to happen. To mitigate this, I provided some hints for the player to help them safely navigate the trap, even in a stressful or surprising situation. The first hint is the presence of the coins, which most players recognize as a signifier about where to go in the level. By following the trail of coins as it swings side to side down the shaft, the player should safely avoid the spike traps which start to appear the further the player descends. Not only does this guide the player to the safe space to stand on the platform, but the decreasing number of coins also acts as a countdown timer to prepare the player for the final jump they must make before falling into the lava below. As a further clue, I added some red dotted line blocks that can provide a warning of approaching spike traps as they approach from below. Combining these blocks with an on-off switch ensures that the blocks have a visible red outline, without acting as a platform that Mario can stand on to break the intended falling sequence. To activate the button, I added a thwomp directly above the doorway that the player emerges from, ensuring that the thwomp slams down on the button as soon as the player loads into the area. This had the added benefit of creating an effect that looks like the thwomp has triggered the lift platform to free fall as part of the trap. All that was left to do to complete this sequence was to add the horror sound effect to the blue lift platform to trigger a suitably surprising audio sting and keep the effects running as the player descends. Jumping off the platform into the room at the bottom ends the effect, and the player is rewarded with a checkpoint for surviving the trap. After all that, I wanted to ensure that the player arrived in a relatively safe area without any impending threats or enemies, so that they had a chance to recompose themselves and prepare to begin their upward journey again. When thinking about the purpose of this space, I imagined that this was a refuse area where trash materials were discarded into the lava below. This gave me the idea to use conveyor belts rather than the regular scaffold platforms, to provide an alternative navigation challenge that was also in keeping with the theme of the room. Since the player must counteract the movement of the conveyor belt, it makes timing your jumps a bit more difficult without greatly threatening the player with death or failure at this point. Once reaching the top of the room, players must now control their movement on the conveyor belt and time their run to dodge under the thwomps that are here as part of the refuse process. The helmet protects Mario from the crushing effects of the thwomps, but if they mistime their run, they can still take damage from the side and lose their helmet. The conveyors are split in two halfway, creating an additional challenge to jump to the other belt whilst also fending off the thwomp from above. Once past the third thwomp, players can hitch a ride on another crane to the storage room above. It is in this room where players can now replace their Buzzy Beetle helmet with a new spiny helmet. If needs be, I provided a spiny beetle on this crate that players can intentionally hurt themselves on to lose their currently equipped helmet, or alternatively they can rebound a spiny shell to hurt themselves instead. I provided another little escape hatch for any bouncing shells to be discarded so that a new helmet can spawn. And to continue the colour coding of the pipes, the red pipes will always contain a spiny helmet for the players to equip. Once equipped with the spiny helmet, players can bust through the wooden floor above and enter the next room. I created a raised platform with some coins to the right of the room to entice the player over here. Doing so would force the game camera to reveal more of this room so that players could discover what was going on above their heads and indicate that they need to use the scaffold here to progress. Before the player can access the scaffolding, they must break the blocks above using their spiny helmet. From here, they can repeat the action to reach the second platform. Now the player must time their jumps across to the next set of scaffolding whilst avoiding the spinning grinder blade as it travels up and down the room. This suspended scaffolding has a different arrangement of blocks that need to be broken so that the player can continue to climb. It may also be tempting to ride these wooden blocks upwards like an elevator, but a pair of spike traps above will soon reveal that this isn't going to work. As the player continues to climb, they should also reveal the second optional bonus in the form of a huge 50 coin, with seemingly no way to reach it at this point. That's because the player must continue climbing to the left and then use the moving wooden blocks to collect the coin. Of course, collecting this sends the player back to the bottom of the room where they must retrace their steps. Hopefully the player didn't destroy these wooden blocks earlier as they were climbing up the scaffolding, otherwise they won't be able to grab the bonus this time. The next room has more spinning grinder blades to avoid whilst climbing upwards. This first blade looks more dangerous than it is, since the player can easily walk under the small gap here. The helmet does provide a nice sense of safety either way though. The real challenge with this blade is timing your jumps to avoid it as it appears from below. Reaching the scaffold, the player has another grinder blade to get past by timing their jump as the blade approaches. The next challenge is reminiscent of the thwomp and conveyor section from earlier. This time there are 3 blades moving up and down, which I envisaged were part of a sawmill contraption that is preparing all the wooden blocks in this part of the tower. I didn't include the conveyors this time as the blades were wider than the thwomps. I figured that it would be much harder for the player to counteract the conveyor movement and maintain their position to safely squeeze under each blade. The result is that these blades can be avoided in one move if the player times their run correctly, but I think this is okay. The next room contains the wood chipper for disposing of the wooden offcuts, fed into the machine via the conveyors above. It is once again another case of something that looks intimidating, but is fairly easy to avoid. The third optional bonus coin is available on the other side of the contraption, which players can reach by jumping across the conveyors and down to collect the reward. A single goon brat on this scaffolding can help inform players that they can use the spiny helmet to kill enemies from below. I positioned it here since the chances are the player will jump into the enemy as they attempt to climb upwards. Once higher, the player just has a couple of hops across the scaffolding to reach the next area. However, the presence of the wood chipper buzzing below increases the tension of these jumps, making them feel more challenging than they really are. Now the player has almost reached the top of the tower, but they still must make it past this final contraption, the site's power generator. Players first need to squeeze under the whirring gears, then carefully use the edge of the device to make a tricky jump over the gears in the middle, as indicated by the trail of coins. Landing on the moving platform above should be a moderate challenge, once again made perceptively harder since the player knows that there are dangerous grinder blades spinning below them just off camera. Entering the final room, the player should spot this doorway being guarded by a rocky wrench and be drawn towards it. At this point the camera should shift to reveal the second foreman mini-boss, only this time he has backup. In this encounter, the foreman is standing on top of a platform constructed out of spike traps, so Mario cannot attack them with the spiny helmet from below, and trying to jump on their head will also be difficult. This is made even more challenging thanks to the other 2 hammer bros protecting his flanks and guarding the scaffold on either side of the room. However, these guys can be attacked with the helmet, so dispatching them both before attacking the foreman is usually a good strategy here. Once the player defeats the foreman, they once again receive a key to progress. Now, referring back to the experience last time the player entered one of these doors after a boss fight, they found themselves in a surprise trap that required some quick reflexes to escape. I'm relying on that anticipation of another trap to surprise the player once again, only this time it is a positive reaction as the player braces for the worst and is greeted by a harmless room with a blue exit pipe to leave the horrible high-rise. Passing down the pipe, the player is greeted by another checkpoint and a feeling of relief. This area is supposed to be the exterior of the high-rise construction. After climbing up the inside of the tower, the player has made it to the rooftops, where they will finally meet Bowser's head foreman who is overseeing the building's construction. This section is designed in such a way to create a nice rhythm of movement as the player uses these little ramps to propel themselves forward and jump over the rocky wrenches and under the spike traps suspended above. Carrying forward this momentum, the player can run across a series of blue falling platforms to reveal the 4th and final optional bonus, which is somewhat hidden to the right here. If the player doesn't move quickly, they'll miss this opportunity to collect this final reward. Now it's time for the final showdown, and to put an end to this terrible construction once and for all. The head foreman is the Sledge Bro, the bigger, badder brother of the usual Hammer Bros. As his name suggests, he throws sledgehammers, but he also has a ground pound attack that can stun lock Mario. I created a choke point entrance to this area so that the player had to get close to the boss before they could attempt jumping over them. A couple of grinder blades further reduce the opportunity for Mario to safely jump in the air to avoid either of the boss's attacks. For the most part, the sledgehammer projectile shouldn't pose much of a threat if the player still has their helmet. However, the opportunity to attack the enemy with the helmet is limited since they can only get below them as they jump in the air to perform their ground pound attack. Jumping on the boss's head will kill them, but due to the limited save space above and the frequency of their sledgehammer attacks, it may be a tricky move to pull off. Another option is to obviously use the battle axe to sever the bridge and send the boss falling into the abyss below. Either way, once Mario gets rid of the head foreman, the level is complete, and the construction of Bowser's new high-rise has been stopped for good. All that remains to do now is take a look at some of the things that could be improved in this level. Overall, I was very happy with how the level turned out. and I think I managed to convey the themes and story with suitably engaging challenges and encounters throughout. However, there were a few minor things that I would probably change after replaying the level for this design walkthrough. To begin with, this sequence with the thwomp was one of my favourite parts of the entire level, and I especially liked the opportunity to include an optional bonus coin behind the thwomp for those players looking for a little more risk. However, it is entirely possible that a player can become trapped behind the thwomp if they aren't quick enough. In this situation, the only option is to take the hit and lose your helmet so that you can run through the thwomp and escape out of the tunnel. On the slim chance that the player has already lost their helmet at this point, the only option is to restart the level from scratch. I could have provided another escape tunnel here that would at least send the player back to the bottom area, but this would have meant shrinking the rooms directly below to accommodate this. Since the chance of a player becoming completely trapped here should be slim, I decided not to compromise the other rooms below to create this escape route. Without it though, there is still a chance that a player becomes stuck and simply quits the level for good. In hindsight, I should have made that compromise to prevent players quitting the level, even if this is an optional challenge. In the next area, this rocky wrench is a needless distraction that I could have just removed. They are in an area inaccessible to the player, meaning that they can't be killed, and their projectile attacks are easily obscured by the level tiles, making them an inconvenience that adds nothing to the puzzle. Moving on, the crane jump in the next area is easy enough to reach on the first try, since you can use the blue platforms. However, it is tricky to jump onto the second crane as it is moving, meaning that the player might have to climb back up to this point if they fail. When they try to jump onto the first crane again, they will find this jump a lot more tricky since the blue platforms have now gone. Although the time pressure provided by the blue platforms was a nice addition to make this section more challenging, it may have been better to use a static platform here instead, or even a yellow platform moving up and down, just to simplify this obstacle. In the first mini-boss fight, I wanted the Hammer Bro to stay on the highest platform so that they would constantly be raining down projectile attacks, and the player would have to carefully make their way up the scaffolding to kill them, or use their helmet to bump them off the high ground. Unfortunately, it's all too easy to tempt the Hammer Bro to drop down by just sticking to the lowest level of the room once the player has triggered them. Sadly, this is just a result of the enemy behaviours, and I don't think that there is anything I could do in the level to prevent this. Perhaps you have some suggestions that you could leave in the comments below. I had a similar problem with the second mini-boss fight, where the Hammer Bros would all drop down to the lower levels of the room very quickly, so it often made this encounter easier than intended. On the other hand though, it did end up reducing the effectiveness of the spiny helmet as a weapon, so in some cases, it actually made the fight harder than expected. Speaking of boss battles, the final boss encounter is somewhat compromised due to the presence of the Battle Axe Bridge, which can often be the simplest option for defeating the enemy here. Since this end goal is unique to the Castle Course theme, I did consider using a different theme for this area. In the end, I decided to stick with the same course theme throughout the level, as I didn't like the alternative options for this level's intended story. Since the fight can be rather trivial as a result of this, I did try and make jumping over the boss to reach the axe more difficult using the grinder blades and the choke point as described before. Upon repeat playthroughs, I could have added some additional enemies, such as rocky wrenches that could have provided more projectiles to avoid to make the jump over the boss more perilous. On the other hand, I may just be too familiar with the level at this point, and looking to increase the challenge to match my familiarity. At least when I playtested the level with other people, they found this final encounter reasonable enough, and not everyone used the battle axe to defeat the boss. So that's a good reminder about how important it is to playtest your level with other people regularly. With that in mind, you can try this level for yourself by using the course ID in the description below. There is also a link to my playthrough video of the level if you'd like to watch instead. My next video in this series will be looking at a very different type of level, so watch out for that soon. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.